everybody, it's Allison Harrell with the Fort Bend Museum, and today we're going to be talking about the relationship between cotton and the peculiar institution of slavery in America. Now, before we begin, I want to mention a couple of things. Number one, this is an incredibly complicated subject. We try to keep our videos between 10 and 20 minutes long, so I know that I won't be able to give this topic the amount of detail that it deserves, but I will do my best within the time constraints I have to give you the best overview of the topic that I can. Number two, I want to mention two of my sources right at the beginning of this video. If this subject is interesting to you and you want to learn more, I would recommend starting with these two books. They're available at the Fort Bend County Library System, and they have a number of great resources within them. So if you're interested, starting here will give you a springboard of information to find out more about this topic. Those two books are Great Inventions, The Cotton Gin by Milton Meltzer, and Up Before Daybreak, Cotton and People in America by Deborah Hopkinson. I will give a full list of all sources that I used at the end of this video, but I did want to point out these two books before we even start. Enslaved people were first brought to Jamestown in 1619. Now, they were brought to the Americas in order to grow cash crops, and using enslaved labor for cash crops meant two things. Number one, you were able to plant more crops because you had a larger workforce, and that meant more profits in the end. And number two, the enslaved labor force did not have a choice when it came to doing some task required for some of these plants. Now, these tasks range anywhere from tedious to downright dangerous. So very quickly, we're going to go over a very short list of cash crops and some unique things about each crop. The first one on my list is tobacco. Tobacco is especially special on this list because rather than focusing on quantity, this is a crop that was always focused on quality. The quality of the tobacco crop was seen as a direct reflection on the farmer who grew it, which meant that there was special care taken with each one of these plants. It was more of a skilled labor situation than some of the other cash crops, so it was a little bit unique. The next crop on my list is sugar. Now, in the Americas at this time, sugar cane was the main producer of sugar. Sugar cane itself is not a difficult plant to grow, but that's not the hard part. The hard part is the harvesting and processing. So once you start harvesting sugar cane, you have to follow through and process it to get raw sugar before you can stop, which means that as soon as the harvest starts, it becomes a difficult 24/7 job that involves at least 5 giant kettles with a constant fire, so you have flaming hot sugar at all times, which is incredibly dangerous. Now, the next plant on my list is rice. Rice is kind of an interesting one. America started exporting rice to England by 1699. But interestingly enough, rice has been grown in West Africa for thousands of years. There's actually a lot of conjecture that the early rice framework in America was actually set up by the enslaved labor force. Now, there's not a lot of evidence to support this, but we do know that it was growing in Africa far longer than it was growing in America. Next on my list is indigo. Indigo is only briefly used as a cash crop in the Americas, and that's because right before the American Revolution, the farmers in South Carolina figured out they could plant indigo. They very successfully produced it into a dye, and at that time, England was paying extra for anyone making indigo. They really, really wanted that blue dye. They were willing to pay heavily for it. Now, after the American Revolution, England was not willing to pay those extra prices in order to get the blue dye anymore, especially not from American farmers. So indigo was very quickly a cash crop and then very quickly fell out of favor just as quickly as it became popular. Next on my list is hemp. Hemp is a very fast-growing plant that has many, many applications. You can use it to make paper or rope. If you process it as a fiber, instead of getting linen like you would from flax, you actually get burlap. So hemp is a very useful plant that grows very quickly. Now, last on my list is cotton. Of all the cash crops I've talked about today, cotton actually takes the most labor. Cotton requires 3 times the amount of people to harvest and grow it than any other cash crop I've talked about combined. So let's talk more about cotton. Now we're going to go over the cotton life cycle and harvesting process and sort of detail the labor that was required when the enslaved populations were in charge of growing this plant. Now, a lot of this information comes from Solomon Northup. He was born a free man, but was kidnapped and spent 12 years enslaved on a cotton plantation. He then later wrote the book 12 Years a Slave. So a lot of this particular part comes from him, though there are some quotes from other people as well. So as you may know from our cotton life cycle video, the cotton seeds are planted in March or April. So right as the weather starts to get hot, that's when you want to plant your cotton. Now, he details that the cotton fields were hoed 4 times. Now, what that would do is that would eliminate any weeds or any extra plants or anything that was a potential threat to the cotton plant would be hoed out from between the rows of plants. The last time you would hoe between the rows was in July. So this was done during very hot weather, especially in the American South. Now, picking began in August. The enslaved were expected to be in the fields at daybreak. A horn was blown an hour before daybreak, and that gave you enough time to get breakfast, grab water, get your lunch, and head to the fields. At noon, there was a 10 to 15 minute break so everyone could eat their allowance of cold bacon. Food was distributed to everyone on Sunday. You would get 3.5 pounds of bacon, enough corn to make a peck of meal. Now, no one was allowed to leave the field until the order was given, and that order wasn't given until well into the night. One of the other sources I've seen quoted 9 o'clock as being the time that the order was given to leave. Every enslaved person had a bag, and it would go over the shoulder and drag behind them. Now, Richard Orford was quoted as saying, women in those days could pick 500 pounds of cotton a day with a child in a sack on their backs. John Walton, who worked in the cotton fields of Bill Walton's plantation, recalled that even us kids had to pick 150 pounds of cotton a day or get a whooping. Now, every day's haul was weighed. This was a great source of anxiety for the enslaved because that number really determined how well you did. You were expected to hit the same amount of cotton every single day. Now, if you picked more in one day than another day by 10 to 20 pounds, your daily expectation was raised. It would never go down. There was no way to decrease the expectation. You could only increase it. Every day's haul was brought to the gin house and weighed. If you picked the same amount you did the day before, you were pretty safe. If you picked more, that meant that you had to keep that increase in productivity for every day henceforth. And if you picked less, then you might potentially be in line to get punished for it. This is a quote from Solomon Northup's book. Then the fears and labors of another day began, and until its close there was no such thing as rest. He fears he will be caught lagging through the day. He fears to approach the gin house with his basket load of cotton at night. He fears when he lies down that he will oversleep himself in the morning. Such is a true, faithful, unexaggerated picture and description of the slave's daily life during the time of cotton picking on the shore of Bayou Boeuf. So for this next part, we're going to be talking about the United States output in cotton in bales by year. Now, I couldn't find a unified data set of all the years and all the bales, so I had to grab numbers from a number of different places, which means that sometimes the number I have is from one specific location, and sometimes it's for the entirety of the United States. So I'm going to be putting a graph across the bottom of this video so you can see the change over time. When it is a green bar, that means it is just the number from one location or one area. It's not the number for the entire United States. So when it's a blue bar, it's the entire US. When it's a green bar, it's just one area. And I'll mention the areas as I go. So the first one was in 1768, 43,000 pounds of cotton, which is about 100 bales, were shipped from Virginia to Great Britain. So not a bad start. Now in 1791, 4,000 bales was the US output for the year. So again, not too horrible. In 1793 is when Eli Whitney patented his cotton gin. His gin was designed to remove the seeds from cotton, and it could remove the seeds from 50 pounds of cotton in a day, which before would take 500 hours of labor. Now, this gin vastly sped up the process of the final step for the farmer. So in order to sell cotton at market, you had to get all of the seeds out. So this gin vastly improved that step. Now, this particular invention only benefited the cotton farmer because the value of cotton was fixed on the world market, which meant that the only way to make a huge profit from it was to grow more and more cotton. This motivated the southern planters to grab more land and get more enslaved people to grow more cotton, because the more cotton they grew, the more they could sell and the better profits they would have. This invention came in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, so there were a number of machines that were being invented that were vastly improving all aspects of life. Now, I'm just going to mention a few machines that specifically impacted the textile community. And that's important because there was a more demand for this cotton because they could be processed easier on the other end as well. So in 1764, James Hargreaves invents the spinning jenny. This allows you to spin multiple yarns at one time from one machine, even though it was at the time operated by hand. In 1769, Richard Arkwright invented the water-powered spinning frame, which vastly improved and sped up that process of spinning fiber into yarn. In 1807, Robert Fulton invented the steam-powered engine. Now, this engine had a lot of different applications across many different industries. So in the textile industry, this machine, this engine, could actually power these other textile machines that had been previously invented. So it could spin yarn faster than if you were operating the machine by hand. Now, on the other hand, it also helped to steam power boats, which made the boats go faster and they could haul more. So this was a way that the cotton farmers could get their cotton to market faster. It is important to note that all of these machines might not impact the cotton farmer directly. Cotton farmers would not have been concerned with spinning wheel improvements. However, they did increase the world market for cotton. More cotton was necessary in order to use these machines, which brings up another really interesting point. Now, it's important to note that not everyone who benefited from cotton and from the labor of the enslaved people was a cotton farmer. While the southern United States were focused on growing cotton and producing more and more cotton, other parts of the world were focused on using that cotton. So the first cotton mill in America was built in 1787 in Massachusetts. It failed after 3 years because at this time, Britain really had cornered the market on mills and creating giant factories to produce things like cloth. The London Economist claimed, "The lives of nearly 2 million of our countrymen are dependent upon the cotton crops of America. Should any dire calamity befall the land of cotton, 1,000 of our merchant ships would rot idly in dock. 10,000 mills must stop their busy looms. 2,000 mouths would starve for lack of food to feed them." So there was a big industry being built around cotton. So let's get back to the numbers of bales produced. So we know that in 1791, the U.S. output was 4,000 bales. But now, after a few inventions, a couple of years, in 1801, the U.S. production was 10,000 bales. Now, by 1810, there were over 200,000 enslaved Africans to support this system. Since the cotton gin vastly improved production times, plantation owners wanted more land to plant more cotton to process faster in order to send it to market. So they started looking south and west to grab more and more land. Now, this became an issue because there were a number of Native American tribes that had been living on this land. These tribes had been doing their best to assimilate to the American culture, but despite their best efforts, the Indian Removal Acts of 1830 were still passed and they were forced off their land. They even went so far as trying to use the American legal system to let them keep their land, but they won the court case and still lost their land. In 1825, the U.S. produced more than 500,000 bales of cotton. In 1840, 55,000 bales of cotton passed through Apalachicola, Florida, which was a busy port town. Now, just 13 years later, in 1853, that same town saw 140,000 bales, so quite a drastic increase. Now, by 1860, the U.S. output was up to 5 million bales of cotton. 3/4 of the world's cotton was grown in the South. There were about 4 million enslaved people to support this system, and in places like South Carolina and Mississippi, the enslaved populations actually outnumbered the white populations in the same areas. Now let's talk about Texas for a little bit. When Austin was first bringing colonists to Texas, they were already used to the enslaved labor force-based economy that was flourishing in the United States. Austin has even been recorded as having said, "The principal product that will elevate us from poverty is cotton, and we cannot do this without the help of slaves." So they already knew that an enslaved labor force was necessary in order to make cotton profitable at the time, and also that cotton was going to probably be the cash crop they were growing. Now, the enslaved labor force actually benefited a few settlers more than others in a really interesting way. So right after the Mexican War for Independence, the land grant system that was being used in Texas went through a number of changes. That's because the newly formed Mexican government was going through some growing pains trying to figure out what was the best system to grant land. For a very brief period of time, land grants were given based on the number of capable people within the household that did not take into account those that were enslaved versus those that were not. So a number of settlers who came to Texas with large enslaved labor forces were actually eligible and got additional land because they had more capable people in their household. So just sort of an interesting note. An 1825 census of Austin's colony found that there were 443 enslaved people within the colony at that time out of the 1,800-person population. Now, slavery is one of the many reasons that has been cited as the cause of the Texas Revolution. And that's because in 1829, Mexico completely abolished slavery within its borders. Now, Texas was given a special exemption because there were clearly already an enslaved workforce here, and they were allowed to keep their workforce at that time. But many of the slave holders within Texas started to become nervous that their slaves would be taken away. So the revolution happens, everyone within Texas is allowed to keep their enslaved labor force, and we continue on. In the early 1860s, the majority of the world's cotton supply was being grown in the American South. Now, this one crop accounted for 59% of all American exports at the time, so it was a pretty big deal. On the other hand, in 1861, the estimated number of workers in the textile industry, anywhere from cotton cultivation to cloth production, was 20 million people. So that equals about 1 in 65 people who were alive at the time. So the whole industry is a really big deal. To give you some numbers, Great Britain at this time was using around 800 million pounds of cotton every year, and 77% of that cotton was coming from the American South, which equals about 616 million pounds just from the American South of cotton being used in Great Britain. So when the Civil War broke out, cotton became a huge bargaining chip for the Confederacy right off the bat. The Confederacy saw cotton as a way to make other countries support them by withholding the supply that they had that everyone else wanted. So the first thing they did was they stopped exporting cotton and they burned 2.5 million bales of cotton to create a market shortage. So now everyone in the world needed it and there wasn't a massive supply for it. Now this plan backfired on the Confederacy for a number of reasons. The first one was that up until this point, the southern United States had been performing at a bumper crop rate, which means they'd been making so much extra that a lot of places like Great Britain were able to actually stockpile extra cotton so that they could have it in case something like this happened. So that shortage that was supposed to hit the market immediately didn't. It took a while. By the time the Confederacy was ready to start exporting cotton again, it was already too late. The Union troops had already seized their ports or blockaded them, so it made it really difficult to get cotton out of the Confederacy to the places that needed it. I need to point out two things at this point. Number one, just because a port is blockaded doesn't mean it's not useful. There are a number of people that made quite a bit of money by blockade running during the Civil War. This means they'd put all their contraband goods into a boat and just run it through the Union blockade and hope they made it through. Now, this did succeed quite often, so that meant that people were able to get products out of the Confederacy and to foreign ports, which meant that there was a steady stream of money. The problem was that this was a risky and unpredictable system that wasn't the guaranteed profits that the Confederacy was used to. So there was a system, it wasn't great. Now, on the other hand, number two, the northern United States also depended on Confederate cotton in order to make things like cloth, which meant that the federal government set up a system where you had to be pre-approved in order to buy cotton from the Confederacy, even during the Civil War. Now, this system was rife with corruption. It was a terribly done system. Now, during the Civil War, because of that market shortage that the Confederacy started the war with, when that market shortage finally hit the market, the price of cotton skyrocketed, which meant that as the Union was slowly conquering the South, any cotton that was seized, the Union troops could sell it for a massive profit. So they did. So now that we know how cotton was used during the American Civil War, the shortages that were created by this war, let's talk about what happened after the Civil War. With the end of the Civil War, the passage of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment, which gave equal protection to all, and the 15th Amendment, which gave men the right to vote, the peculiar institution of slavery in the United States was effectively over. So that does nothing to change the demand for cotton on the world market. So how did the labor force change in reflection of this? The first thing is that a number of new cotton markets opened up. Because of the shortfall created by the Confederacy, India, Egypt, and Brazil all started growing cotton for sale. These were markets that had previously pretty much been untapped, but they saw a shortcoming and they decided to fill it. So within the United States, the labor force changed. So previously, most of the labor force for cotton were enslaved workers, and now they were no longer enslaved. So a number of people, once they were freed, wanted restitution in the form of 40 acres and a mule. This dream never happened. However, a lot of people started sharecropping. This was a system where people would rent land from a landowner, and when harvesting season came, they would give the landowner a portion of their harvest. So it gives you a lot more personal autonomy. People were able to change within their families who worked and when, but it kept them beholden to someone else. So it was sort of a change in the right direction, but not necessarily a fully great change. It was also at this time that a number of small farms that were predominantly white started growing cotton. Now, before the Civil War, these farms had been focused on subsistence farming, so they were just growing the crops they needed for them and their families. But with the end of the Civil War, these farms saw a real opportunity to start growing cash crops like cotton in order to make a decent amount of money. So they switched over and they made a pretty good profit. Now, there's one other source of labor that has to be mentioned, and that's convict labor. Prior to the Civil War, prison systems were trying to find ways to become sustainable or even make money for the state. In Texas, Huntsville Penitentiary was focused on cloth manufacturing. After the Civil War, there was not as much demand for the rough cloth that the prisoners had been making, so they started looking for other ways of making money. The idea of convict leasing was born from this desire to make money and also to alleviate the massive overcrowding issue that this prison system was facing. Convicts were soon leased out to private landowners to take on harvesting and planting jobs in what would become known as slavery by another name. This practice was put under legislative investigation in 1910, and outside leasing would end completely by 1914. So between the sharecroppers, small white farmers, convict leasing, and plantation owners that managed to pay wages to their workers, the cotton industry in America actually managed to recover pretty quickly after the Civil War. So by 1870, they were back up to 4 million bales of cotton produced. But by 1900, they had produced 10,266,000 bales of cotton in just that 1 year, which is double the amount that was produced in 1860. Now, in 1911, 16.25 million bales were produced, and 10 million of those were exported. That is the highest point of cotton production that I could find within the historic numbers. Now, between 1911 and 1921, the United States was at an all-time cotton production and export high. It wasn't until 1921 that the cotton production dropped below that 10 million bale number. So they were producing at an incredible rate. The last thing I want to mention is sort of the largest change in labor force that the cotton industry has seen in years, and that's mechanical harvesting. So up until the 1950s, mechanical harvesting for cotton wasn't possible or popular. So it started appearing in the 1940s. By the 1950s, it was becoming popular and widespread. And by the 1970s, most of the cotton producing farms in the United States were all mechanically harvested. And that is true today. Having said that, the most efficient way to get cotton out of a field is by human hand. So even though it's less efficient, we all just use the mechanical harvesters. So today, the United States is one of the world's top producers of cotton. In 2012, 17.3 million bales were produced in the United States, and 25% of that cotton is produced in Texas. So as you can see, cotton and the enslaved population really did go hand in hand for quite some time, but even after the abolishment of slavery, the cotton production still increased because people saw it as an opportunity to make some money, to cash in on a crop, and to do a number of things. So I hope this video was informative and I hope it was helpful. So I'm going to very quickly go over the list of books that I used when researching for this video so that if you're interested, you can find them and learn more. The first one I have is a bit of an interesting one, and it's one that I would absolutely recommend. The book's name is Working Cotton. Now, it was written by Shirley Ann Williams and illustrated by Carol Bayard. Now, this book is fascinating to me because it's sort of a children's picture book. It's actually, the text is all based on a poem that Williams wrote. Her family were migrant farmers, so they would go from field to field and pick crops, cotton being one of them. So the illustrations are beautiful, the text is gorgeous, and it's a wonderful, very, very simple book that covers a very interesting topic. So it is definitely one that I think is good for all ages. The next book up is Great Inventions, The Cotton Gin by Milton Meltzer. This is one of my favorite books of all the ones that I read. And I do think it is important to note that this book doesn't just focus on cotton farming, it also spends a lot of time on cotton factories. So those factories where the cloth was being produced, it does go into that and about how those systems worked in America. So it's kind of interesting, and none of that information was useful for this video, but it's an interesting aspect to think of. The next book is They Made America by Harold Evans and Gail Buckland with David Leffner. This one has a number of different inventions in it. It goes more into the cotton gin than necessarily cotton and the enslaved, but it was a useful resource. Another book that I recommended at the beginning of the video, Up by Daybreak, Cotton and the People in America by Deborah Hopkinson. This one was an excellent book, and it includes a number of first-person sources within it. They used a lot of oral histories and different quotes from different people, so you get a lot of different viewpoints on everything covered. So I found it really helpful. So those are the books that I found the most useful, and I hope that you found this video useful as well. Thank you.